Good afternoon, everyone. Just while we're waiting for other people to join us from the waiting room, we're going to launch a poll up on screen, and there'll just be 2 questions for you to provide some feedback to us, and they'll be up for about 15 to 20 seconds, so quite a short snapshot if you can just give us some feedback via those polls. Okay, if we just look to start wrapping up poll 1. Great. So the question was, do you know where to find support within your organisations on mental health? Quite a reassuring amount of you there who have responded with a yes. And for no, 18%, we'd hope to give you some information in regard to that as part of this webinar today. Okay, so we should have another poll just coming up very soon onto your screen. Do you feel your employers are invested in mental health and wellbeing? Great, so the results actually quite similar to the first question, so 81% yes and 19% no. So again, as part of today's webinar, we'll be touching on maybe some of those reasons as to why employers should be invested in mental health and wellbeing, and hopefully some practical tips for yourself as well as an individual. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. My name's Rebecca King and I am a committee member for the ACE Northwest. I'm also head of learning and development for Curtins, and I'm also responsible for leading on our mental health and wellbeing strategy across the business. So welcome to this ACE Insight webinar organised by ACE Northwest on mental health awareness. As we all know, mental health and wellbeing has steadily moved up the business agenda over the last few years, but it's certainly throughout the pandemic being thrust into the spotlight. Increased levels of stress and poor work-life balance, as well as daily uncertainty, the long-term impact of this global event will be an ongoing challenges for businesses to navigate over the years to come. So today we've got some special guests. We've got Liggy Webb, an award-winning and best-selling author, Jake Young, Research Associate at Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, and Martin Lockham from a construction-based charity, Mates in Mind. As we have lots to get through today, we won't have a Q&A session, but I please welcome you to send in any questions and we will certainly follow up after the webinar today. Just a small point on housekeeping, we will send you a recording of the webinar and also share a copy of the slides in the next few days. Keep your eyes peeled for that so you can watch back as well. So now I'd like to introduce our first speaker today, which is Jake Young from CIPD.
Perfect. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for giving me the chance to speak at this webinar. I will quickly just share my slides, so just bear with me 1 second. Just doing things on the fly. Okay. There we go. So hopefully everybody can see those slides. So yeah, as I said, thanks for letting me speak. So today I'll be talking mainly about one of our recent evidence reviews that we've been doing in the research team at CIPD. So just a little bit of background on me. So I'm Jake Young. I'm in the research team at CIPD. I often jump on various different projects with my work. So I've been involved in things on learning and development, things like engagement, also diversity and inclusion. But I've been really heavily involved in a number of these evidence reviews. So today I'm going to particularly focus on our recent evidence review into wellbeing and digital working. But as you can see, or hopefully can see on the screen, I've kept the front pages of a couple of other recent reports that we've done, notably on employee resilience and developing effective virtual teams. I've kept these up just because these 3 come as a nice little package. They're all focused quite nicely on mental health and well-being, but also focus on the digital working side of things, which has obviously become extremely prevalent, more so probably than ever in the last year or so, which is something I'll go into in a little bit more detail in a minute. So just for a bit of context on this research then, obviously in the last 18 months, we've seen the COVID-19 pandemic. This has led to many organizations making extreme changes to how they operate, and also their staff having to navigate new ways of working and changing personal lives. And we already know that work pressure can increase in tough economic times as employees are expected to do more with less. We also know that the UK lags behind many other countries when it comes to providing a good work-life balance for staff. And if we combine these things with concerns about things like furlough, health and safety, isolation, and returning to work in the future, it's no surprise that there's been a much greater interest in the well-being of employees during such turbulent times. So what this does is it provides us with a really good opportunity to look into the best available evidence on these ideas. So in particular, as I mentioned, well-being among digital workers. And as I mentioned, given that organizations have had to swiftly adopt these new ways of working and indeed look set to continue to do so moving forward, there have been concerns about how these new methods, particularly using digital tech, can affect well-being. So there is kind of this overall question about whether working remotely provides employees with freedom to balance their working life and their home life, or whether it actually creates a blurring between the two and results in staff feeling pressure to be what's called always on, or kind of tethered to their workstation and unable to switch off. So naturally, this is a really relevant time for us to explore the evidence on this area. So a bit of context briefly about our evidence reviews then. So at the core of CIPD's purpose are the concepts of being principles-led, evidence-based, and outcomes-driven. And these are key to the knowledge and the behaviors and the values which we think should underpin today's people profession and help us prepare professionals for what's coming and to succeed and shape a changing world of work. So what do we actually mean by evidence-based then? This is the idea of evidence-based practice, and this concerns the idea that good decision-making can be achieved through, firstly, thinking critically, but also drawing on the best available evidence. So this means relying less on things like anecdotes and received wisdom, sources that on their own may not be entirely trustworthy. And instead, evidence-based HR draws together 4 sources. So you've got scientific literature, organizational data, stakeholder values and concerns, and professional expertise. And this is a really clear and established process, as you can see from the graphic. And what it does is it helps us ask practical questions and make more effective decisions. So we focus particularly on 2 of the 4 sources of evidence with this review. So that was the scientific literature and professional expertise. So to do this, alongside the Centre for Evidence-Based Management, or CEBMA, we conducted what's called a rapid evidence assessment, or REA. So it's basically a really short, systematic review that gets to the heart of the best available evidence. So these give a really good, reliable summary of the current state of research on a particular topic. So that was what the literature side focused on. We also discussed the implications of the research with 10 HR directors across 2 online workshops to get their professional insights. So we focused on mental well-being here, but particularly on how contemporary ways of working, notably digital technology, can influence this. So as I mentioned, it's widely assumed that poor work-life balance, feeling pressure to be always on, and adopting virtual work can negatively influence employee well-being, and thus their ability to contribute meaningfully in both their professional and their personal life. So there were 4 areas that we wanted to focus on in particular here. So the first was the nature of well-being, then we had the drivers and risk factors to well-being, the relationship between digital working and well-being, and the effect of management interventions. So we wanted to explore this idea of techno-stress, as I mentioned. So firstly, looking at the nature of mental well-being, we find that it's more than simply the absence of mental health problems or disorders. So not being mentally ill doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is mentally healthy, as you have to consider other positive states such as happiness and satisfaction. So like physical health, mental health can move on a spectrum from, say, good mental well-being, moving down to difficult emotions, and then to severe mental health problems. If we look at risk factors then, over several recent decades, there have been a large number of really good quality studies that have been published on factors predicting mental well-being. So from this, we get a really consistent view of a number of work-related drivers of mental well-being. So in particular, we focused on 3 here. So the first is the nature of our jobs, and this affects mental well-being in various ways. So workers' mental health is likely to benefit from job control, thinking about things like autonomy and empowerment, but it's likely to suffer from things like excessive work demands, long hours, as well as organizational change. We also found good work relationships to be a really important factor. So these are key to avoiding mental health problems through things like social support, which is a positive influence, and then a negative influence can be things like bullying and conflict. We also have the third factor, psychological factors that play a really important role. So the main risk factors are a perceived imbalance between effort and reward, and more generally perceived injustice, as well as employees' sense of coherence. So that means whether they can kind of comprehend, find meaning in, and manage events that happen at work. And if we look closely then at digital work and well-being, this is an area of research that is growing on work-related technology and digital work, but there's clearly a need for better quality research, at least when it comes to links with mental health. So the body of research that we currently have is unfortunately not strong enough to give confident recommendations. And there are also some potentially conflicting findings. For example, the idea that digital technology can cause stress, or on the other hand, there is evidence that it can help people achieve a better work-life balance. So this may look a little bit bleak. However, this doesn't leave us with nothing on links between digital work and mental health. So for example, we found a particularly good systematic review that looked at this idea of always on working and people working digitally outside their normal working hours. And this found that digital work has mixed effects. So there is some research that suggests that using technology can improve job control, but other research finds no link. Also, while working digitally outside normal hours can improve performance, it can also result in greater job demands. Similarly, while using tech can result in a better balance between work and family for some, others struggle to disconnect from work, which obviously causes a conflict between work life and home life. So what we recommend from this is that leaders try to ensure employees feel they have autonomy in how to use their time effectively. And one really important finding that came out from this was the idea that even if employees are working outside their normal hours using digital tech, they feel that they're in control of that, and that's a personal choice. So it's really important that managers allow them that control to do so. So managers should also role model working flexibly and as well as taking time to switch off from work when needed. Clearly, though, this behavior can be dependent on the individual and their context, so giving them that level of self-management is really important. So there is some good emerging research here. And while we wait for more, what we would say is employers would do well to focus on how digital working in their organizations may contribute to those risk factors that I mentioned earlier. Then finally, if we look quickly at management interventions, the most impactful of these include improving workers' mental health literacy, stress management, things like resilience training, and also contemplative interventions such as mindfulness. However, we do find that when compared to the risk factors that I mentioned earlier, we see that the effects of management interventions are small. So again, employers and HR professionals would probably do more for employees' mental well-being if they targeted action at reducing those risk factors. Pardon me. So in terms of recommendations quickly then, we recommend that leaders and managers design people's jobs in ways that reduce those mental well-being risk factors. So for example, provide them with autonomy and flexibility with how they choose to work. Try to strengthen workplace relationships to avoid mental health problems. Quality relationships where openness and support are encouraged between leaders and their teams and between team members are really important. And then finally, try to reduce those psychological factors associated with mental health problems by fostering the right work climates. So ones that value rewarding employees and ensuring they feel they are supported and they feel they get meaning from their role and from their organization more widely. So just a couple other things to support this work. I wrote a CPD Lab article looking specifically at the systematic review that I mentioned just earlier, pulling out the key findings from that. I would recommend having a look at that if you're interested, because it's got some really interesting and important findings there. Also speaking at various events. And another lab article that was written by my colleague Jill Maxwell in the research team, which is called In Their Own Words, and that focuses on the focus groups that we held with HR directors around this research, and that just brings some life to their words, so it has a really nice qualitative feel to it. And I think just quickly, there's also our various other evidence reviews if there are any topics you're interested in. These should be coming to it, CPD Evidence Hub very soon, which will house all of these in their various forms. So the most technical reports will be there, so those will focus closely on the research methods, and then we'll have more practitioner focused practical guides there as well. There's just a bit more information, and that's all from me. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for letting me speak. As I said, if anybody wants to get in touch, do feel free to talk to me on LinkedIn or Twitter or email me, and have a great rest of the webinar. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Jake. That was really insightful. Very interesting research going on there at the CIPD. So next, I'd like to welcome our second speaker for today is Liggy Webb.
Hello and good morning. I never know whether to say good morning or good afternoon. It's that time of day, isn't it? But I do hope that everybody has had a great morning so far. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here with you today. So thank you very much, Rebecca, for inviting me, because I get to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is all around stress and how we can avoid burnout, because we're talking very much here about the well-being and the mental health agenda, and it's such an important part of this in terms of how we can look after ourselves to be happy, healthy and productive, because this is essentially what it's all about. So I'm just going to introduce myself to you, just give you a bit of my background so that you know what some of my credentials are as far as this work is concerned. So my name's Liggy Webb. I work as an international consultant all over the world with lots of different organizations. So I've been working as a consultant for the United Nations for about 15 years now. So I've worked out in some of the peace missions, the war zones, met lots of interesting people from lots of different backgrounds. And currently I'm doing quite a bit of work with the National Health Service. I'm doing some work as well with government. And I've also been working with the BBC and across sector and in construction as well. So it's been a very interesting time really trying to understand how people are feeling about this world that we're living in at the moment that is very volatile. There's so much uncertainty about and lots of pressure as well, because not only are we living through a global pandemic, we're also living against the backdrop of the fourth industrial revolution, which is all about rapid change and technological advancement. So for us as mere mortals, keeping up with all the things that we have to do to look after our well-being can be very challenging. I've written over 35 books now on a range of different topics, including my bite-sized book series. I'm a massive fan of distilling complexity and keeping things really practical, because often we can build up a lot of knowledge, but the real wisdom is about the application and what we actually do with it. So I've been working in this kind of area of well-being for the majority of my working career. So it's been very interesting to sort of understand what well-being is all about and all the different things that we need to do to help ourselves to be able to cope with the challenges, the various and inevitable challenges that we're all going to experience. So clearly, we're going through a lot of uncertainty at the moment. You know, we don't know what's around the corner. And what we tend to do as human beings sometimes is we get out our imaginary crystal ball and we start to fill in all the missing gaps. And we don't necessarily do that always with the best case scenario. Sometimes we start to do the worst case scenario and we start to awfulize and catastrophize about all these terrible things that could potentially happen. And obviously that is going to make us quite anxious. But what we're doing when we do that is quite natural in a way, because that's the way we've been designed to look after ourselves, to deal with any kind of uncertainty with fear. Because then we would release all sorts of stress hormones that would prepare us for what is commonly known as the fight or flight or freeze. And that's what our ancestors used to do. We'd either fight the big beast, run away from it, or freeze and play dead and hope it didn't notice us. What we need to do as modern day individuals is override some of that instinctive reactive behavior, step back and consider our responses and the kind of support tools that we have available to us. So I guess at the moment, there are quite a lot of challenges, and looking at this picture here, I think it's a good description of what burnout is all about. You know, we're either firing on all cylinders or we're pushing ourselves to that point of overload and overwhelm where we end up feeling absolutely burnt out. And burnout, just to be really clear, is what happens to you when you avoid being human for too long. Because what I mean by this is we as human beings only have so much capacity. We have got our fragilities, our vulnerabilities. And if we keep pushing ourselves into a space that is unhealthy and unrealistic, then it is going to take us to that point where we're completely burnt out. And burnout isn't something that you take a weekend off to recover from. Burnout can affect people for a long, long period of time. A very high percentage of visits to doctors are triggered by stress-related illness. So we do need to be very mindful of that. And according to the World Health Organization, pre-pandemic, stress burnout was the 21st century health epidemic. Now, clearly, we've been through, or we're still going through, a global pandemic. But many people that I speak to express how exhausted they feel. I don't know whether people out there listening today are really finding that when they're describing the way they feel, it's, exhausted, feeling really tired, perhaps feeling quite anxious. So lots of expressions. And of course, there will be positive emotions that we're feeling as well, because the future in many ways can be very exciting. We can, of course, feel quite hopeful. But burnout is something that is very real, and we need to be very aware of it. And it does, of course, affect our mental health as well, because when we get stressed, we take our body out of a balanced state, and that can have an effect, obviously, on us physically, but that will also affect our emotional well-being as well. So the impact of stress doesn't need to be underestimated in any way here. And that's why over the last few years, I've been developing this model around stress intelligence. And I would go as far as saying that the most important relationship that any of us can have in our lives, particularly around our mental and physical well-being, is our relationship with stress. Because stress is not the enemy. We are going to experience pressure. We are going to experience stress. Sometimes it can galvanize us and it helps us to protect ourselves. But when we have heightened levels of stress for prolonged periods of time, that's when it will push us into a space that simply isn't healthy or sustainable. So what I wanted to do was to really break down stress into 5 component areas. So looking at how we raise our awareness around our own relationship with stress, understand what stress does to us, and then prioritize self-care, look at our lifestyle management and our everyday energy. And I think being aware of stress for ourselves and also for the people that we look after is really important. I'm kind of a big believer that it starts with us. If we can really kind of manage our stress, then what we learn and how we perform and how we conduct ourselves will have a really positive impact on other people as well. So I'd suggest that you take this time right now for yourself, an opportunity for a bit of self-reflection, to ask yourself a few questions, and then I will share some information and also share my details as well. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn or email me afterwards and you've got additional questions, I've also got a little present for you as well at the end of the presentation. So just to manage expectation, we've got a very short period of time to cover a very big topic. I'm going to suggest you treat it a bit like a giant thought buffet of ideas, because there may be some things I share that don't resonate for you, and that's fine. There may well be some things that are fresh thinking, always new things we can learn. However, there will be many, many things that I share with you that you'll be thinking, well, I know that, but it's not what you know, it's what you decide to do with it. So it's entirely up to you what you would like to take away. So first things first, just to take a bit of time really to stop and think about stress. So I'm going to ask you to think about yourselves for a moment. It's important to be aware that one size doesn't fit all. So there isn't this magic one solution in terms of how we manage our stress levels. We really need to kind of drill down and understand ourselves. So there's 3 important questions that we can ask ourselves. The first one is, what triggers your stress? So just take a moment right now to just consider, what is it that triggers your stress? So the kind of things that would take you from feeling, okay, maybe a bit under pressure, but coping all right, to that point where you think, I'm completely stressed out here. So maybe I'll share. For me, I find time pressure. If I know that I've got deadlines and the clock's ticking and I'm really conscious of it, that can make you feel quite pressurized. Perhaps interruptions. Sometimes when you're trying to focus. I conducted a survey a few years ago and I asked people for what their different stress triggers are. And number 1 came in as other people, which I thought was quite interesting. But I think, other people sometimes, perhaps if we have conflict or people prioritizing their priorities over yours as well, and all the demands that we have. The second question to ask yourself is, what happens to you because again, we're all different. So when you're getting really stressed, how do you know you're stressed? Do you get irritable? I know I get a bit snappy. Perhaps you get tearful, perhaps you get headaches. Some people get palpitations, cold sores, rashes, loss of appetite, or you gain your appetite and suddenly you want to eat loads and loads of things, and you don't tend to want to eat lots of carrots. It tends to be chocolate biscuits and snacks. Perhaps you end up drinking too much. All sorts of things that can end up happening when you get quite stressed. And then the third question you really need to ask yourself is, what do I do to manage that stress? Now, there will be unhealthy coping mechanisms, like maybe eating and drinking too much, or, just sort of like not putting any effort into exercise or self-care. And then, of course, there are some really healthy things you can do. So getting outside, getting fresh air, exercise. Jake's already mentioned mindfulness as a technique. I know lots of people who are focusing more on, yoga, breathing, all sorts of different things that we can do to really manage those stress levels. And I think those three questions are key. What are your triggers? How does it manifest itself? But what do you do to manage it? So raising your self-awareness around stress is key. I just want to talk very briefly about what stress actually does to us, because I'm sure that we all have a basic level of understanding. As I mentioned, stress isn't the enemy. We are going to experience stress in our lifetime, but what we need to do is learn to rein it and manage it to the best of our ability. So if we go back to the 1930s, we didn't actually used to use the term stress when we talked about ourselves. It wasn't until a Hungarian endocrinologist, a guy called Hans Selye, was doing an experiment in a laboratory in Montreal with some rats, that he identified something that is known as general adaption syndrome. Now, Hans Selye is commonly known as the father of stress, because he really enlightened us into what happens when we get stressed, but more importantly, when it pushes us to that point of burnout. He talked about something known as distress, which is unhealthy stress, and eustress, which is positive stress. So the general adaption syndrome goes like this. First things that happens when we get stressed, when we perceive that we're under pressure and danger, we release hormones into our body, a cocktail of hormones, predominantly cortisol and adrenaline, that do a little relay in our body to prepare ourselves for what's known as the fight, flight, or freeze. This is what our ancestors used to do. But at that state, we also take our body out of a state that's known as homeostasis. And homeostasis is all about where, our heart's beating fine, our blood sugar levels are good, our blood pressure's okay, our immune system is functioning well. The second stage is known as resistance. And that's where we either decide that we are still in danger or still under pressure and we need to keep these stress hormones going, or we're okay now and we can revert our body back to a state of homeostasis, a state of balance where everything's functioning well. If, however, we perceive that we're still under pressure, that we're still stressed, we take ourselves to the third stage of the general adaption syndrome, which is exhaustion. And this is what will lead us to burnout, because, if your heart's pounding all the time, that's going to affect your cardiovascular. If you're eating too much, if you're not eating, that's going to affect your blood sugar levels. If you're under pressure, you're going to elevate your blood pressure. And also you're going to start to suppress your immune system, so you won't be able to fight off all the different things that happen. I don't know if anybody gets the point sometimes where they're working really, really, really hard and they're feeling okay, and the minute they have a holiday, they end up catching a cold or just feeling really unwell. I think sometimes that can happen because adrenaline and cortisol can mask quite a lot of symptoms as well. So we need to be very wary of that. And Hans Selye, he wrote some really, really interesting books and really interesting papers. But one of the points that he made was adopting the right attitude can convert a negative stress into a positive one. So the mindset that we adopt around stress is really important. So I'm just going to bring you on to the third area of the stress intelligence model, and this is all around self-care. And I'm going to go as far as emphasizing this point, that self-care is not a luxury, it's an absolute necessity. You know, earlier Jake was talking about in the workspace, we need to create much more autonomy for people. But with that, when we're giving people autonomy, we also need to provide them with the space to prioritize their own self-care as well. That's really important. And to understand that self-care is giving the world the best of you instead of what's left of you, because sometimes that's what we end up doing. So prioritizing me time, making sure that we create throughout our day pockets of time where we can stop, we can rest, we can replenish, we can re-energize. That's really important. I'm seeing too many examples in the work that I do with people who are finding it really hard to switch off. And most of all, with the new hybrid way of working, creating really healthy boundaries, you know, understanding what those boundaries are and getting into good habits. You know, we are creatures of habits. Over 40% of what we do on a daily basis, we do habitually. So good habits is important. So creating me time, managing our inner superhero, because we're not superheroes, they're only in comic books, and we have to be aware of how much capacity rather we have. You know, it's not endless. We're not an endless source of energy. We only have so much, so we need to be aware of that. And as I mentioned, personal boundaries. When we set boundaries, that is a demonstration of a really healthy respect for ourselves. Because if we keep saying yes to everybody else, in the end, we end up saying no to ourselves. And that's not a good place to be, because then we end up feeling quite resentful. And that's obviously not a positive emotion. So remember, you are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. And I think that's a useful mantra to bear in mind. The fourth area really around stress management is creating a lifestyle, and it's putting in place some very basic things that are really important to us as human beings. So first and foremost, being aware of how many plates you can spin, because often if you're taking on board too much, some of those plates are going to drop. So what we need to do is process. So when we take on extra information or extra work, then we need to let a little bit of that go as well. And the other thing is to bear in mind is what we consume. So, for example, there are some foods that we end up eating that simply aren't good for stress levels. Caffeine, for example, caffeine actually triggers cortisol, which is one of the stress hormones. So, you know, when we're in a stressful period in our lives, it's much better, obviously, to eat a very healthy diet, because that will help us to be able to manage our energy levels as well. And if I was going to share my major one top tip, if anybody said to me, I'm really stressed out, what would be your absolute go-to? Honestly, it would be keeping yourself hydrated. It's amazing how many people don't simply drink enough fluid. And one of the wonderful things that pure water does is it flushes our body of some of those toxins. So when we have a buildup of stress, sometimes we feel a bit irritable, a bit raggy when we're getting stressed. Actually hydrating yourself and drinking water can have a really positive effect. And it is about exercise as well. That's a really important one, you know, because when we get up and we stretch and we move around, that breaks down some of the toxins that build up. But also going outside, getting lots of fresh air, particularly at this time of year, we need to get as much vitamin D as we can, and we need to get as many daylight hours. So going for a nice brisk walk. There is evidence that demonstrates that if we walk 10,000 steps a day, then that is as good as a mild antidepressant. It's very good for our mental health as well. So exercising as much as we can. And sleep, this is a really, really key one. There's some interesting research that's been conducted around the quality of sleep that modern day human beings have. And we don't necessarily prepare ourselves for sleep, but sleep is one of the most restorative things that you can do. And there are different stages of sleep, but the deepest stage of sleep, what it does is it suppresses our body's ability to release stress hormones. So it helps us to really replenish and recharge. But in order to get to that deep state of sleep, we need to create relaxation. So again, it's really key that we look at our whole behavior around sleep, creating really positive habits around that. One tip I would give around sleep is don't take technology in the bedroom, because so often, you know, we're checking our phone just before we go to bed, we're filling our heads with agitation, you know, perhaps we wake up in the night, we look at our phone. None of those are particularly helpful. And when it comes to our everyday energy, we have deposited into our morning time account 86,400 seconds. We choose how we spend them. And that means that we need to be well organized. Time management in this world that we're living in that seems to be quite boundaryless, and there's constant deluge, isn't there, of all sorts of things that we've got on our to-do list. Making sure that we're well time managed and prioritizing time for ourselves. So when we do our morning schedule for the rest of the day, we actually put ourselves on that schedule. We create pockets of time so that we can recharge and we can release, if you like, some of the pressure so that we decrease those stress levels. That's really key. And getting into good habits, noticing what you do when you get stressed is something that's really helpful. And I love this poem from the Roman poet, line rather, from the poet Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, that says, take a rest. A field that's rested gives a bountiful crop. And that's really, really key. The quality of our work and our ability to be truly productive is about getting a good balance in our lives. If we're on output all the time, we're just going to end up exhausted. And that's where mindfulness is a fabulous technique. I'm a huge advocate of mindfulness. There's some very good apps out there. Headspace, Calm, Buddhify is very good as well. Mindfulness is taking scientific evidence and ancient principles of Hinduism and Buddhism and just helping people to be human beings as opposed to human doings. So giving ourselves the opportunity to be in the present moment with awareness. It's taking time to just slow down and to be. So there's all sorts of different exercises. Breathing exercises are really good. A technique that I'm very fond of is something known as guided imagery, where we literally take our heads on a holiday. So when we've got all this kind of clutter in our heads, we take the time to just stop and think about a lovely place that we go to. And in our mind's eye, you know, imagine, what's it smell like? What does it taste like? What does it feel like? What can I see? Because the subconscious doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's artificial. So when we do that, the subconscious starts to believe that we're actually there, and it will trigger all the associated physical responses to that experience. So it can lower our blood pressure, it can make us feel calmer, it can help to manage our cardiovascular. So all sorts of very positive benefits for doing that. And you can just Google or just go to YouTube and put guided imagery. And there's some really good examples of exercises you can do. If anybody does yoga, possibly your yoga teacher uses guided imagery as well. And I guess when it comes to technology, we really do need to get some good habits in place. So, you know, physically, the way that we're sitting with technology, we're moving around with technology, but also giving ourselves time to just switch off, to disconnect. Maybe even, you know, when you look at social media, set an alarm and say, right, I'll give myself 10 minutes to have a look at what's going on, and then I'll come out, because it's a bit like a rabbit hole, isn't it? You can end up in there looking at all these bits of news and information, and some of it can make us feel very anxious, particularly around fake news. You know, a lot of media stories are very negative. So it's about making sure that we create good disciplines around technology and having tech-free time. I think that the tech stress that we get can really be helped by just having that techno holiday time. So that's the stress intelligence model. Lots of information, as you can see, that we've packed into a pretty short period of time. But if you do want to know more about it, then just get in touch with me if you want to connect on LinkedIn, or if you just want to email me, liggy@liggywebb.com. This is my website. If you scroll down on my website, there is a free area there with loads of different resources, so podcasts, videos. But I'd also like to offer you an opportunity to have a little gift as well for joining me today. So if anybody would like a free copy of my bite-size, I've got a little bite-sized book on burnout, how to avoid it, which covers absolutely everything that we've covered in this presentation. So please do get in touch, and I'm more than happy to just pop a copy in the post to you. So thank you very much, everybody. I do hope that that's been useful. Bit of food for thought, an opportunity for you to take some time out for reflection. And I'll now hand you back over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thanks, Liggy. That was fantastic and really good insight, and, as you say, reflection as an individual, really. And that stress intelligence piece is great. I've also got my bite-sized books to hand. So I'm a complete advocate of these and always have them at arm's reach. So thank you very much, Liggy. Our final speaker for this afternoon is Martin Lockham, and Martin's from a construction-based charity called Mates in Mind.
Hi there, everyone. Yeah, I'm Martin Lockham from Mates in Mind. We are a mental health charity formed in 2017 to work with the construction sector, really to raise awareness, understanding, and start to destigmatize mental health in the construction industry. So first of all, what do we mean by mental health in work? Well, as Jake's already touched on, everybody has mental health, and it's a variable. You can be diagnosed with a mental health illness, but have good mental health. You can have no diagnosis or no signs of mental health, but have poor mental health, and it varies day to day mental health. Any of us are susceptible to short-term distress. 1 in 6 employees in any week in the UK are subject to some form of common mental health issue, normally stress, anxiety, or depression. And 1 in 100 per week are diagnosed with a serious mental illness. So what pressures do we all face then at work and at home? And the two are interlinked. Some of the areas we see coming through in construction are the same in many different sectors, really. So financial concerns is one of the main ones that cause people stress and anxiety. Health problems, relationships. Through COVID, what we've seen are increased number of people understanding and appreciating loneliness or having to care for family members. And again, at work, what we see is a lot of people who are concerned about job security, and they're uncertain about the future, and they have concerns about the nature of the work that they're doing. We see a lot of people reporting issues around the deadlines, especially in construction where there are big projects, tight deadlines with high budgets. So there's a lot of pressure placed on individuals in regard to that. Often the work environment isn't a particularly welcoming area, and that causes people to be anxious in their surroundings. We see a lot of within construction, a lot of people having to travel and spend a long period of time away from home. And so that causes a lot of people to be stressed or face some form of anxiety. The actual support that people receive and the relationship with their managers has a massive impact on mental well-being in the workplace. And obviously that can be surrounding around things like the degree of control in that job or constant change that might happen within their role. As I think both Jake and Liggy kind of touched on, stress, we expect that people are going to experience some kind of stress, but what we really want to see are within the workplace, people being challenged. We don't like to be too in that boredom zone where we're not really doing enough. We're not challenging ourselves. That can bring a form of anxiety around itself. What we want to see from employees and what we feel like we want as individuals is we want to be challenged and show that we are actually progressing and feeling as though we're actually achieving something. And that actually helps us be on top of our work and perform well. But obviously, if that stress is an ongoing issue, then it starts to turn into strain and fatigue. And what we do see is people start to make poor judgment and decision-making options. And again, if that still continues, that's then where we start to see breakdown. Things start to go seriously wrong, and it really can start to have an effect on people's mental well-being. Unfortunately, within the UK, 2019 saw a 2-decade high to suicides. Suicide is the #1 killer of men under the age of 45 in the UK. And in construction, a UK construction worker is almost 4 times more likely to take their own life than the average working population. That works out roughly 2 construction workers every working day in the UK currently taking their own life. Worrying, the statistic that we see often is that actually only 27% of people who have taken their own life have actually been in contact with a mental health service the year before, which again shows that people often reach crisis point, don't know where to turn to, and often don't reach out to people as and when they need to. So some really horrific statistics within construction especially, hence why we're working with the industry to really try and improve and destigmatize the issue. Obviously, you can't attend a webinar these days without the C word getting mentioned. And the Centre for Mental Health, midway through COVID, actually did some research where they found that roughly 500,000 more people in the UK are expected to experience poor mental ill health as a result of COVID. It's anticipated that around 42% of people are reporting an overall mental health decline. And obviously that's through around 60% of stress, 60% of people are facing greater anxiety, people are feeling more exhausted, especially through the situation, and 50% more irritable. So there's a lot of talk about what the new normal might look like and what the mental health impact, especially as we come back into the new world, the new working world, what that might be when you consider things like remote working and changes to people's conditions in work. Perversely, COVID as a mental health charity has actually helped us raise mental health awareness, though. It's because we've all been in a very similar boat. We've all been through something together, something uncertain, unsure. Now, there's certainly different people have been through slightly different experiences with construction. They were classed as key workers, and we were very much back into the industry very, very quickly after the start of the first lockdown. But overall, we've been through something different: uncertainty, worry about our physical health, worried about our loved ones, that isolation, loneliness, being put into lockdown. It's actually helped people really understand and be more aware of their own mental well-being and of that around them. And some of the things that we've seen really is from a business perspective that people have actually kept more in contact with the staff. There's been more regular communication, more talking and asking how people are. So from a mental health charity perspective, as I say, perversely, COVID has actually helped raise awareness, which is a beneficial thing, especially because what we see with mental health impact on business, as we mentioned, 1 in 6 employees each week are reporting a mental health condition. In fact, the HSE report that 54% of all working days lost can be attributed to stress, anxiety, or depression. Now, poor mental health in the workplace roughly costs the UK economy around £45 billion per year, huge sums of money. And again, a similar kind of theme. Research shows that around 60 to 90% of employees will actually give a different reason for their absence. So the flu, the bad back, rather than actually feeling empowered and able to actually say to their employer that I'm suffering from stress or anxiety or depression. There was some research done recently by the CIOB of just over 2,000 construction workers in the UK. And what we found actually was that around 97% of employees confirmed that they experienced some form of stress. We saw that 90% of people felt overwhelmed, and obviously as a result, 95% have experienced poor concentration, which, as you can imagine, on a construction site can be incredibly dangerous and affect the health and safety regulations there. The working environment, as we've mentioned, can have a real impact on people, and time pressures really cause around 94% of those surveyed to experience high stress levels. They also found, obviously, the actual facilities, the environment, and the uncertainty of the work location can really cause issues. And again, 70% of people did report that there was stress due to poor communication with those organisations. And so why is it really important that we start to look at this? We don't see having a mental health and mental well-being programme in place as a benefit and reward initiative, as a lot of people originally did. It's a strategic business imperative. There's a thing happening at the moment, the Great Resignation, which I'm sure you've all heard about, following COVID, where people are reassessing their lives. And in a recent survey, what people have actually reported is the reason that they're leaving their jobs is the number one reason is workload. Number two, again, that management style. And actually, number three is that work-life balance. People have reassessed what's gone through and have a look at how their employees have actually dealt with them through the crisis and have started to really assess their work-life balance. I think Libby made a really interesting point on the stress. We research that we've looked at, it shows that 1 in 3 GP fit for work notes are issued for stress, and that, I suppose, links to the HSE 54% of employees reporting stress-related absence. 50% of employees report taking that stress home with them. So you can't just leave it at the work door, or you can't just leave it at the home door. It's there with you all times. It's not one or the other. It's very much aligned. And 1 in 3 actually cite the reason for leaving their workplace is as work-related stress. Now, a lot of people that we talk to, a lot of the organizations that we work with aren't really aware that they have a legal responsibility. If you have more than 5 employees in your workplace, you have a legal responsibility to have in writing stress risk assessment. You have a duty to protect their employees from stress by undertaking assessments and acting on those. And that applies at an organizational, departmental, and divisional level, as well as obviously for the employee. So it's really important that employers consider their legal responsibility and act on any workplace stresses. So what do we see? Now, fortunately, we don't see any real organizations that we talk to or any managers who are thinking we don't, they're swinging the lead. Mental health, it isn't anything. Those days we believe are well behind us. But obviously what we've said is organizations want to do more, and it's often a case of not actually knowing where to start. And so what we do see is that a lot of organizations start with the tertiary measures. So they go to the point of need. So we've seen an increase in the use of mental health first aid within the workplace. Around 35% of construction organizations surveyed reported that they now had 35% of mental health first aid. A lot of organizations are turning towards or signposting helplines and using apps. And these are all really, really critical because we know that people have different choices, different ways to actually turn to for that support. So having a variety of different models in place is beneficial. But as a charity, what we want to see are organizations starting to look more towards the secondary and primary measures rather than just the tertiary. So rather than the reactive, we want to look at the preventative. And that involves things like upskilling employees to have all employees, not just a small cohort, to have an understanding of, first and foremost, their own mental health and how to spot the signs in their work colleagues and how they can start a conversation with that work colleague and signpost relevantly to these great tertiary measures that a lot of organizations now have in place. Unfortunately, what we saw from the research is that 71% of construction workers reported that they had received no general awareness mental health training in the last 3 years, a situation that we think really needs to change. And then above that, from a primary measure perspective, we want organizations to really start to look at things like the HSE management standards and start to consider how they can support their employees by looking at things like job design, looking at how much demand control support, what the relationships are like within the workplace, what the role looks like, and how change affects individuals, and really making relevant changes and conducting stress risk assessments to ensure they're identifying stresses and acting on them as quickly as they possibly can. What do we see? Well, obviously from that graph, tertiary measures are one of the leading things, and that's fantastic. But what we do know is from human help seeking behaviours that there are barriers to people reaching out for that support. First and foremost, it's actually acknowledgement. And obviously we're working very much in a male-dominated workforce. And that self-identification is one of the first steps. It's actually often other people that will spot signs that somebody might be struggling. And so it's really important people are able to understand that they can spot those signs and how they can support. Stigma is a massive issue, obviously. It's that, should I talk about mental health in the workplace? Will I be judged? Will I be pigeonholed? Will I be looked over for promotions? Will I be considered, the person over there in the corner with a mental health condition? We shouldn't talk to them. So people weigh up the perceived benefits and how confidentially these helplines that the workplace are advertising are. Will it get back to my boss? And so it's really about, is it the right time and place for people to talk about these? And so we need to, as a workplace, understand how we can knock down those barriers to support. And that, again, we need to really consider is some people find it easier to spot issues in others rather than acknowledging signs in themselves. So we really want to encourage people to spot signs and start that conversation. We might we might be more likely to actually reach out to someone closest to us rather than professional help. And in fact, we look at it as in 3 main categories. We have the friends, the family, the close work colleagues that are the first pool. Then, unfortunately, the second pool is generally do nothing. And then the third pool tends to be the GPs, the medical professionals, the helplines, the mental health first aiders. So it's really important that close network of people we have around us can help spot signs and that we can support each other from that perspective. We've also got to remember that just because help is available, such as apps, helplines, mental health first aiders, not everybody will ask. We shouldn't just assume that because the help is there, people will reach out for it. We should try and offer our support to people and signpost to those relevant support services. So what can organisations really do to help their own mental health plan and get themselves fit for mental health within the workplace? Well, there's mental health commitment at work. And we really recommend organisations that this part of the work that we do helps organisations get this in place. So we're looking at prioritising mental health at work, having senior owners and board level accountability, monitoring mental health and wellbeing of the employees. We want to see people have a positive work design and culture. So that piece about the primary measures, how are we going to measure that? How are we going to look and investigate through employee feedback? We can address worker impact, so the address on culture, review that work-life balance with the employees, and always encourage openness in the process. We want to promote that then open culture around mental health, almost give permission to talk about mental health, make it aware that as an organisation, we want to see an open culture discussion around mental health, increase awareness, challenge mental health stigmas, empower those employees to be champions of mental health, and encourage two-way conversations about that mental health. Increase the confidence and capacity to increase literacy, upskill all employees to that general mental health awareness, not just a small cohort. Ensure that all the managers feel empowered to spot signs and support employees within their team that could be struggling. Obviously provide work and tools, so looking at resources, toolbox talks. Make sure that if you have a remote workforce, that all of your information is not just on the intranet where these people aren't actually able to access. Make sure that it's visible and actually identifiable for all employees. And then we really want to see people actually setting a plan and actually having metrics to measure the distance traveled. Have a plan. What have we done? Have we achieved it? What's next? So that this is continually improving and improving, so that we can see a more mature approach towards mental well-being in the workplace. Ultimately, though, this isn't just the responsibility of the board of directors or of health and safety and HR. Everybody has a part to play. And if we can incorporate all of our workers, then we become the front line of worker well-being by supporting each other, by looking out and starting the conversation with each other. So the work that we do as a charity, essentially, we work with around 500 organisations now in the UK, as I say, predominantly from the construction industry. We start normally by doing an assessment so we can understand where the organisation is, for want of a better saying, on the journey. What have they got? A lot of the organisations we work with are just starting out, and that's absolutely fine, because then we can start to really help them understand the policies, procedures and practices that they can bring into place, and we can start to look at models that might work for them as a business, depending on their size and scale. We work with them to design, plan and implement an actual plan. And it's so important that an organisation put an actual formal plan together, not just take a chance and do a training day every so often or have a poster on the wall. Let's have a real positive approach to this. What are we going to do? Why are we going to do it? If we've already got support structures in place, let's make sure that they're really, really relevant and doing the job they were. So if we have got, as we've seen, a lot more mental health first aiders, let's make sure that we've got support services around those mental health first aid. Let's make sure that we're capturing relevant data that's going to help us make informed decisions on where our strategy will go forward. So let's make sure that we optimize all support structures that we have within an organization. And then, as we said, let's start to monitor, review how we're doing, and make sure that we adjust and we go forward with our plan. And it's really critical that organizations have a steering group, a lead, who can really take this on and drive it forward within the organization. As a charity, our role really is to support those organisations. Once we've identified the gaps, there are many different ways that we can help people, be that through awareness training, be that through actually helping organisational culture. If it's communication, line manager support, we're there really to help support organisations really start to put together a mental health plan. And ultimately, what we want to see is organisations moving from the tertiary levels that we currently see, where people are reactive to issues, where we have minimum legal compliance, and the support services are more focused towards that point of need. We want people to actually start to develop a mature programme that lets us start to use that multiple data sets to make an informed approach. It helps us really bring about proactive intervention rather than reactive. And we want everybody to take ownership within an organisation to really drive out the stigmas that surround mental health. And that is what we do as a charity. There are a lot of great charities out there doing a lot of great work. Obviously, if anybody does know anybody that is struggling at the moment, or if you are yourself, please reach out to one of these support services. They're all available on our website to find as well. And obviously, as the guys have said, if we can support anybody in any way, please search us on the web and contact us. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Martin. I think it's really important to have this conversation around the context of our industry, so thank you for bringing that to us today. We're sadly out of time. Many thank you to everybody who's listened today. We hope you found it interesting. Thanks also to our guests, Liggy Webb, Martin Lockham and Jake Young, for their fascinating perspectives, and thank you all again for your time. Just to follow on with this conversation, you may also be interested in the upcoming webinars and workshops organised by the ACA on building resilience and stress. So we will send you more details on those with today's webinar recording and slides. So thank you for your time and look forward to seeing you again.